Brightside Global Trade TV today. Elton Brewington, Brightside Global Trade TV. And we are excited about our upcoming guest. And he is a entrepreneur. He's an Army lieutenant and the author of The Armed Forces and American Social Change. A premier business owner. You can tell he takes great privilege with his history and what he's been able to do. With that being said, we are delighted to introduce Mr. Troy Mosley. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Mosley. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you so much, Elton. It's my distinct pleasure to be here amongst this august group of entrepreneurs and authors. One minor correction to the intro. I'm a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel.
Okay.
Not that it means anything to anyone, but just
Yeah, it does. It does. Retired Army Lieutenant Colonel. Oh, that's more. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. No, you've earned those stripes. You earned those stripes. No, I would not like to take one away from you. Not one.
As long as it doesn't impact my retirement pay, it's all good.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. But it does significantly represent the work that you've achieved, and that's a big deal. One, Frederick Douglass said, "You may not, get everything you work for in this life, but you're gonna work for everything you get."
Amen. Amen.
Yeah. Very good. So your floor, Troy, your floor.
Sure. So the name of my book is The Armed Forces and American Social Justice and Unwritten Truths. And it debuts today. My publisher is Roman and Littlefield. You can find the book on Amazon. And essentially, in a nutshell, similar to the previous guest, it is my life story as told through the lens of military service. Like the guest before me, I am an African American who descended from formerly enslaved people, probably 4 generations removed from slavery myself. My father, Joshua Mosley Jr., was also an Army officer, Vietnam era, who was fortunate enough to grow up in the shadows of one of America's preeminent historically Black colleges and universities, Florida A&M University. He grew up in a small town called Monticello, Florida, about 10 miles east of Tallahassee, where Florida A&M is located. He was raised primarily by a single mother. She had 8 children, 5 boys and 3 girls. That sounds familiar, huh? And she had a 7th grade education. But she knew that education was important to change the trajectory of her kids' lives. And she made sure that they took advantage of the education that was afforded to them through public schooling. Of course, at that time, schools in the Deep South, my father was born in 1946, he's 75 years old, were segregated schools. And though they lacked the resources that the schools for white children in that same community had, what they did have was a nurturing village of people and teachers and administrators that really took the task of educating their youth to heart. And they made sure that they identified the children that had a intellectually curious, and they would not allow them to slack off. They would make sure that they were challenged academically, the best subject matter that they had. They would make sure that they did their homework. We've all heard that expression, it takes a village to raise a child. And I say all of that to say my father grew up in a very nurturing village. And because of his proximity to a historically Black college, he was able to go to college upon graduation. So of his 8 brothers and sisters, one is a dentist, his older brother, Julius. My father graduated with a BS in biology. He was going to become a doctor, but I came into the world and he changed his plans and he joined the Army. He was in ROTC at Florida A&M. He got his commission. He's a Vietnam era officer. He went into the Army. One of his brothers is a pharmacist. His oldest sister is a teacher. The middle sister has a PhD in education. His two oldest brothers went into the Army. One retired as a E8 or master sergeant, and one got out as an E7. But it was because of education that he was able to change the trajectory for himself, his brothers and sisters. And I always knew growing up, but not for the fact of my father's sacrifice and service in uniform, the opportunities that I had and my sister would have not been possible. Now, I say my father was part of a transformational generation. His father was abusive. And when the boys were physically big enough to kick him out of the house, that's exactly what they did. But they knew that their mother wanted them to get an education, and they worked hard to do that. Again, I say my father was a transformational figure because he grew up working the fields before and after school, plowing, using mules, and they didn't have indoor plumbing. So he went from an outhouse, and in his generation, he had a house with a swimming pool in the backyard. And those are the conditions in which my sister and I grew up, in a predominantly white community in the Deep South. But we always knew our history. It kept us humble. Our parents used the traits that were instrumental in raising them: God-fearing family, belief in community, belief in family. They instilled those qualities in us. And so as I started my career in the military, I was always aware of that history and the history of Black Americans in general in this country. And it is through military service that Black Americans were able to articulate the strongest argument to equality. If we were willing to fight and die for this nation's interests, then surely this nation should be willing to grant us as a community of people the freedom that we fought for others to attain in foreign wars, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, etc. And so in my book, I talk about many historical moments where Black Americans had to demonstrate they not only had the willingness to serve, but that they had the ability to serve. There were virulently racist official policies that the military had that precluded Black men from fighting in combat. And so it was through civic engagement, men like William White, Walter Hasty, pushing for Black men to be given the opportunity to serve in uniform beyond grave diggers and mess attendants. And so it was through these traditions that America slowly began to see that the barriers that we had put in place as a part of our de jure segregation were artificial. The Black World War II veterans returned home to be met with violent resistance to any change that they expected as a result of their service. And the same phenomenon happened during World War I, but the country in the early 1900s didn't have the wherewithal or the stomach to engage our apartheid type society. President Harry Truman was a World War I veteran. He lived through that. So when this story began to play out again, when the service members came back home from World War II, he had lived through this, and he commissioned the first presidential panel to study the problem of equal treatment under the laws. And so this presidential commission came back with a 400-page report called To Secure These Rights. And each of the recommendations they made eventually became codified into law as the foundation of the modern civil rights movement that would happen in the 1960s. One of the recommendations that Truman took from this committee was to desegregate the armed forces. And he did so through an executive order 9981 in 1948. That was 6 years before Brown v. Board of Education. And it was cited as a working model for how an integrated society could work when the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal as a law was unconstitutional. So in my book, I not only talk about the military's evolution regarding racial inclusion, I talk about the military's evolution regarding women being included in the workforce. The service academies in 1976 gave us our first tradition of women in large numbers in STEM careers. When the Naval Academy began to accept women into their nuclear submariner program, and the Military Academy at West Point began to accept women as mechanical, chemical, and civil engineers, there was really no argument that the Purdue's, the Georgia Techs and Virginia Techs of the world could formulate to oppose the admittance of women. So the military was on the forefront of advancing women in STEM careers and other things. Someone's not muted. And other advances for gender equality like pay equity. The military gives us our first example of women being in charge in leadership positions of men. And I talk about the military's evolution regarding LGBTQ equality. Don't ask, don't tell was a compromise that was input in place by the Clinton administration.
Yeah.
And over time, the military found that not only is it important that people be able to fully disclose their identity and who is important in their lives, that the policy was prohibiting our gay and lesbian service members from attaining their full level of potential because they were living a somewhat closeted professional life. And I make the argument in my book that under the Obama administration, the ending of Don't Ask, Don't Tell had a positive impact or exerted outward pressure on marriage equality. Now, I understand that there are people who don't agree with marriage equality. I think as a society, we are better off when we don't place limitations on any of our citizens based on race, religion, gender, or sexual orientation. One of the things I believe that makes America exceptional is for the first time in the history of the world, the framers, men had the audacity to put in writing that all men are created equal. And by that, we extend to women as well, as all people, all human beings. And that is the cornerstone of representative democracy. Today, our society is more polarized than ever. We saw that with the January 6th attack on our nation's capital. For whatever reason, thousands of Americans felt compelled to try and overthrow a free and fair election because they felt they were losing their country. And it was said by Clarence Page, a famous reporter, during the O.J. Simpson trial, race is one thing you can't keep Black Americans from talking about. And race and racism is something that it's very difficult to get white Americans to talk about. And so what I hope to do with my book is to set the table for a thoughtful conversation on our nation's evolution with equality through all of its lenses. We fought a civil war to end slavery. It took us another 100 years to enforce the constitutional rights that were supposed to have been put in place at the end of the Civil War. We lived through the Jim Crow period. And even after 100 years of living through that, we still have tangible data that informs us we are not completely living in a free and equitable society. And so there is some work that still that still needs to be done. Everything that is confronted can't be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it is confronted. And that's what I hope to do with my book, Unwritten Truths, the Armed Forces and American Social Justice.
Thank you so much for that, Lieutenant Colonel. We really appreciate your comments and the book itself. It stands on solid ground, and you make some incredibly great points about, and poignant, that over the last 100 years, and even the typical members of the military who've suffered under silence to pursue, brilliant action and never be recognized. That it reminds me of the story of the Harlem Hellfighters, out of Harlem,
Yes.
and yeah, and they were, oh man, in fact, they only could. Hang on one second. I'm sorry for that. Is that better?
Yes.
France would be the only ones that would give them, recognition, and even to date. So your story, I mean, your representation, and I commend you. I also want to share with you, and we want to have you on our roundtable here because we have some important discussions and questions to consider of what things look like for the next era and how we really, as achievers, and you yourself, it speaks to the point of, put your head down, work. I imagine, yeah, and it's so
I have
symbolic
a
because.
couple pages about the Harlem Hellfighters in my book.
Oh, is that right? Oh, very good. We need to talk offline about plans for that because their story was incredibly remarkable, but only for them. They fought so courageously, but it only to come back to America without recognition. Many became homeless and jobless and alcoholics, and it's not a great story. It's not our finest hour. But these things should be mentioned and recognized and identified. And so, with that being said, I commend you on your great work, and also commend you. Are there any questions for Lieutenant Colonel Troy Mosley? Anyone have any questions?
I don't have a question, Troy, but I admire you for tackling a very difficult topic and being able to put, all that into one book. I'm assuming you could have written a series of books to really encapsulate the issues and the research you did. Do you envision you might do a part two? Were there things you couldn't address in the book just because of volume of research and other topics you weren't able to get to?
Yes. In short, I would like to do a second volume or a second edition. The final chapter of my book, I talk about next steps for the military towards making progress against our stated values of equality and next steps for the nation at large. One of the biggest challenge to our armed forces right now is the issue of sexual assault within the ranks. And you probably know as well as I do, or even more so, the thousands of skilled and trained women that we lose every year because we cannot protect them from sexual predators and people who abuse their authority and position for selfish reasons. And that is something that you could do an entire book about. One of the recommendations that I make in my book for the military to address this issue is to take sexual assault out of the chain of commands adjudication, because I've studied the data, and in my opinion, the chain of command is often too close to these very personal incidents to see them dispassionately and objectively. And also the data tells us that justice is often not meted out, and the women are often the victims. And we've got to do better if we want to maintain an all volunteer force. Women make up about 38% of our armed forces, and we simply have to do a better job of protecting them.
Very good. Thank you. With that, will
Yeah,
come
you
to-
raise a very critical issue, Troy.
Yeah,
Let me just make a
I'm
very
excited.
fast comment and then we can move
You-
on. I'm sorry. But I
no
myself,
problem.
even as an officer, was the victim of that. And it's terrible to admit that. And I don't talk to a lot of people about it, but I was. And I went to a meeting. I was at the Pentagon by then. I was a senior officer. And they were having a roundtable about that topic because they wanted to find out how serious is the problem. And it was a very large auditorium. There were hundreds of women in there. And they asked the women, if you've been a victim of any kind of sexual assault, no matter how small or how bad, would you stand up? Almost 3/4 of the room stood up. And I was appalled. I thought it was a small problem. It was huge. And I'll be honest with you, I don't think it's gotten much better since then. So I applaud you for wanting to talk about that and shed some light, because I think it's been in a little dark corner for a long time. So thank you very much for your book, and I look forward to buying a copy. God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that personal vignette as well.
Troy, I might add that my baby sister is well, she retired as a light colonel, and
Okay.
she was married to a full bird, and they're both retired.
We'll tell her thank you for her service next time you have a chance to speak to her.
Okay, thank you.
Very good. You're the founder of Citizens Against Intolerance. Is that true?
Yes. So as an offshoot to my book and my research, I came across a glaring injustice, in my opinion, which was the fact that the United States military was funding 12 taxpayer-funded bases that were named for Confederates. And in short, these are men who betrayed their oath to country to fight against the United States to preserve an immoral institution. And I said, if we would not build a base in the 21st century and name it for a Confederate, we should not fund bases that are named for Confederates. And so with that, we started a petition, we started a public awareness campaign, and I'm happy to say that in the National Defense Authorization Act that was signed into law in January of 2021, Congress mandated that the bases that are named for Confederates and all other real property, streets, cafeterias, auditoriums, gymnasiums, be renamed within the next 3 fiscal cycles. And so we started Citizens Against Intolerance to push back against all forms of structural inequality that exists in our society.
Wonderful. Thank you. This has been a tremendous pleasure. We thank you for your contributions. We thank you for your work and continue to work. And we also please post your details in our chat so we can make sure that we keep up with you. And we have a couple of things we'd like to share with you down the road. And with that, we're here with Brightside and Brightside Global Trade TV, and we've just wrapped our dialogue and interview with Lieutenant Colonel Troy Mosley. And we have more programming coming up. And we'll end that segment there for the recording. Thank you. All right. Claire? All right. So, right.
So many veterans in the house. I'm Elizabeth Brewington. I'm a co-host with Elton Brewington, and I want to welcome the veterans. We always get overjoyed when we see veterans, especially in the month of November. So I want to just acknowledge each of you and thank you so much for your wonderful service, your wonderful books. You could have just retired and picked up a retirement check, but you continue on doing community service, writing books, coming to a show like ours, spreading the word. And we want to acknowledge you and wish you a very happy Veterans Day. We're going to close out this segment, but Tommy Green.
Before we close it out, there's Mr. Tommy Green there. We can bring him in. Yes.
And Dr. Freeman. So what we'll do is we'll let Tommy Green and Dr. Freeman introduce themselves. Please stay. And then we'll do a roundtable. with
All right,
everyone.
that's good.
Does that
That's
work
good.
for everyone?
Is that
Yes?
okay?
Is that okay with everyone? Okay.
Okay. So let's introduce Mr. Green next.
Wait,
Um,
yeah.